What happens when the only person willing to save a dying man is the one everyone in power wants erased? It was just after midnight at Blackstone Regional, rain hammering the ambulance bay monitors, screaming behind glass doors, and a retired soldier gasping quietly beneath fluorescent lights. His wife knew something was wrong. A combat nurse knew it too, but the doctor in charge saw only another chart, another complaint, another voice to dismiss. Maggie Walker had survived war zones where seconds meant life or death. But that night, the battlefield was an American hospital, and the enemy was silence. Watch this story to the end because it reveals what courage looks like when the system turns against the truth. Like this video and comment where you're watching from. The rain kept beating against the ambulance bay, and inside Blackstone Regional every sound seemed sharper than it should have been. The hiss of oxygen. The slap of rubber soles on polished tile. The dull, mechanical pulse of monitors behind half-closed curtains. A stretcher rolled past with one bad wheel clicking every 3 seconds like a clock counting down for someone who did not know his time was almost gone. Maggie Walker heard all of it. She always did. Other nurses learned to filter the noise after enough years in emergency medicine. Maggie never had. In field hospitals outside Fallujah and Kandahar, the smallest sound could mean a patient was crashing. A breath that changed. A boot dragging in gravel. A young soldier trying not to scream because he did not want to scare the man bleeding beside him. Blackstone did not smell like war. It smelled like disinfectant burnt coffee, plastic gloves, and rainwater dripping from paramedic jackets. But Maggie had learned long ago that a battlefield did not need sand or gunfire. Sometimes it had automatic doors, insurance forms, and doctors with clean white coats who mistook obedience for safety. She stood at the central nurses' station with a tablet in one hand and a pen clipped to the front of her navy scrub top. Her hair was pulled back so tightly it gave nothing away. 47 years old, shoulders, squared eyes steady, she looked less like someone waiting for orders and more like someone measuring the room for weak points. Sophie Grant watched her from the medication cart. Sophie was new enough to still believe there was a correct answer to every crisis. New enough to apologize to patients for delays she did not cause. New enough to flinch when physicians raised their voices. She had been at Blackstone for 3 months, which meant she had already learned which doctors were safe to question, and which ones could turn a nurse's career into a warning label. Maggie noticed the girl staring without looking up. "Your scanner is upside down," she said. Sophie blinked, looked at the device in her hand, and flushed. "Sorry, long night. It has been raining for 20 minutes. The night has not started." Sophie gave a tired laugh, but it died when a man shouted from room 6. Maggie tilted her head, listening. Not panic, not pain, anger. She marked the sound and went back to chart review. "How do you do that?" Sophie asked. "Do what? Know when to move and when not to." Maggie signed off a medication order and finally looked at her. "You listen to what the room is actually saying." Sophie glanced down the hallway where a patient's family member was arguing about wait times. "All I hear is chaos." Maggie's face softened by a fraction. Then start smaller. Breathing. Footsteps. Monitor rhythm. The words people repeat, the words they avoid. "That from the army." "No," Maggie said. "That is from losing people after the room told us they were in trouble and no one listened fast enough." Sophie had no answer for that. Across the lobby, the public face of Blackstone Regional Medical Center gleamed under expensive lighting. The building had been designed to reassure people before they reached the reception desk. Glass walls, stone columns, a wide American flag hanging over the entrance. Bronze plaques honoring donors, veterans, surgeons, and board members. On the wall behind registration, enormous silver letters declared the hospital's promise. Precision, compassion, excellence. Maggie passed those words every day. She had never trusted words mounted in metal. Blackstone sat on the east side of Colorado Springs, close enough to Fort Carson that soldiers' spouses, retirees, and veterans came through its doors every week. The hospital loved that relationship. The marketing department filled brochures with desert camouflage smiling nurses and phrases like military family care. Every Veterans Day administrators lined the lobby with flags and invited local news cameras. Dr. Preston Vance always stood near the front of the photographs, one hand over his heart, his jaw set in a pose that looked humble until you knew him. Blackstone wanted to look like a fortress for the wounded. To the nurses who worked behind the locked doors, it felt more like a fortress for the people in charge. Maggie had been hired 18 months earlier after leaving a trauma coordinator position in Denver. Before that, she had spent 22 years in Army medicine, combat support hospitals, forward surgical teams, medevac stabilization units where the floor shook from incoming rotors and the surgeons worked with sweat running down their masks. She did not talk about the worst days. She did not need to. They lived in the way she checked exit routes when she entered a room, in the way she never sat with her back to a door, in the way her fingers found a pulse before most people had finished asking what happened. In her locker, wrapped in a clean white towel, she kept an old pair of trauma shears. The handles were black faded and scarred with tiny cuts. Tape covered one side where the plastic had cracked. She never used them at Blackstone. She had newer tools for that. The old shears stayed because they reminded her that equipment did not save people by itself. Hands did. Judgment did. Courage did when judgment was punished. At 11:04 that night, Maggie stepped into the staff break room and found 3 nurses talking in whispers. The conversation broke apart as soon as she entered. One of them, Carla Ruiz, looked exhausted. Her eyes were red, and she had a half-full coffee in front of her that had gone cold. Maggie opened the refrigerator, pulled out a bottle of water, and waited. Carla cracked first. Room 12 filed a complaint. Maggie twisted the cap. About what? Her mother waited almost 2 hours before Neuro saw her. She kept saying her right hand felt strange. Dr. Vance said it was anxiety. Maggie took one slow drink. Was it anxiety? Carla looked at the table. Small stroke. Memorial Heights caught it after the family transferred her. The break room went still. Another nurse, Pete Lawson, rubbed both hands over his face. They are saying the delay did not change outcome. Maggie looked at him. Who is saying that? Pete lowered his voice. Pierce. Dr. Nolan Pierce, chief medical officer, had the clean calm of a man who could say terrible things without raising his pulse. He wore tailored suits, silver glasses, and a wedding ring he turned slowly whenever someone brought him bad news. He did not yell like Vance. He did not need to. Vance made people afraid of anger. Pierce made them afraid of paperwork. Carla leaned closer. The daughter said she is going to the state board. She should, Maggie said. Pete gave a humorless laugh. And then what? The complaint disappears, we get another mandatory training module, and whoever charted the first neurocheck gets called into Mercer's office. No one argued. Elaine Mercer ran hospital administration with a smile that never reached her eyes. She knew the name of every donor, every state official, every physician whose departure could hurt revenue. To the public, she was the woman who brought Blackstone its expanded trauma wing. To the staff, she was the voice on the intercom of every cover story. She did not call them lies. She called them language alignment. Maggie had heard that phrase the first month she arrived. A medication error had sent a teenage boy into respiratory distress. The nurse involved reported it immediately. The patient survived. The system should have been reviewed. Instead, the nurse was quietly reassigned. The report was rewritten, and Elaine Mercer held a meeting about protecting the institution from incomplete narratives. Maggie remembered sitting at the conference table, arms folded, listening while Mercer spoke. "We need to be careful with emotionally loaded terms," Mercer had said. Words like preventable and negligent can be misunderstood outside clinical context. Maggie had looked through the glass wall at the ER beyond it, where patients waited under fluorescent lights, and nurses moved with dark circles under their eyes. When the meeting ended, Sophie had not worked there yet. Carla had. Carla had caught up with Maggie near the elevators. "You are not going to last here if your face keeps saying what your mouth does not." Maggie had pressed the elevator button. "My face has seen worse than Mercer." "That may be true," Carla said. "But Mercer writes performance reviews." Now, months later, those reviews had become another quiet weapon. Nurses who questioned doctors were described as disruptive. Staff who documented too much were warned about tone. Residents who asked for second opinions were reminded that Blackstone valued team culture. Team culture meant silence. Maggie did not stay silent, but she had learned precision. She never wrote opinions where facts belonged. She recorded blood pressure time, medication response, physician notification, and patient condition. She used exact words when a doctor refused evaluation. She kept copies of incident numbers in a small notebook at home, not patient records, not protected details, just dates and report IDs that could prove patterns existed if anyone ever had the authority to look. She had not planned to become a whistleblower. That was not a word people chose for themselves. It was a word placed on them after everyone else decided truth was dangerous. Near midnight, Dr. Preston Vance walked into the ER through the physician entrance, already irritated. The air changed around him. He was tall, handsome in a hard way, with silver at the temples and a voice trained to dominate operating rooms. His scrub top fit like armor. A trauma pager sat at his hip. He carried his reputation like a weapon, and in fairness, the reputation had been earned in part. He was fast with a scalpel. He had brought back patients other surgeons might have lost. Families had written letters calling him a miracle worker. The problem with being called a miracle worker too often was that some men began to believe miracles excused everything else. Vance stopped at the nurse's station and scanned the board. Why is Bay 3 still occupied? Carla looked up. Waiting on transport upstairs. For 40 minutes. No beds open on surgical. Vance tossed a chart onto the counter, then find one. Carla's mouth tightened. Maggie stepped beside her. House supervisor already escalated. We are holding 3 admissions and 2 psych evaluations. Vance's eyes moved to Maggie. I asked Carla. You asked the station. Sophie, standing nearby with a stack of discharge papers, held very still. Vance smiled. It was not a friendly expression. Major Walker. Maggie did not correct the rank. She had retired as a major. Vance used it when he wanted to make her military service sound like a personality defect. Dr. Vance, you know most people leave the Army and eventually stop giving orders. Most people enter medicine and learn to take accurate reports. Carla looked down, quickly hiding a reaction. Vance leaned his hands on the counter. I have a donor consult upstairs and 2 trauma transfers inbound. Keep the department moving. I do not want nonsense clogging beds tonight. Nonsense usually means symptoms someone has not taken seriously yet, Maggie said. His jaw shifted. You always have a line ready. No, just the chart. For a moment, they looked at each other across the nurse's station, the noise of the ER bending around them. Vance turned away first, but not because he was finished. Because men like him preferred the last word to land when witnesses were fewer. He disappeared toward the physician lounge. Sophie released a breath. He is going to report you. Maggie picked up her tablet. He reports weather if it does not follow his schedule. That does not scare you. Maggie looked down the hall toward room 12, where Carla's stroke patient had been moved after transfer paperwork began. Fear is useful. Worship is not. The ambulance radio cracked from the charge desk. Blackstone, Medic 4 inbound, 7 minutes, motor vehicle collision. 2 patients. 1 possible femur fracture, 1 minor lacerations. Maggie took the receiver. Blackstone copies, Bay 1 ready. The ER shifted into motion. Beds were cleared. Supplies opened. Sophie pulled warm blankets. Carla checked suction. Maggie moved through it all with quiet force, adjusting, assigning, anticipating. This was the part of emergency medicine she understood best. Not the politics, not the ceremonies. The work. A man arrived screaming with his leg bent wrong beneath a soaked pair of jeans. A teenage girl with blood on her cheek kept asking if her father was okay. Paramedics shouted vitals over the rain dripping from their jackets. Maggie stepped into the center of it, and the room obeyed because she did not demand control. She created it. Pete pressure dressing. Sophie call X-ray. Carla pain meds once Vance signs. Sir, look at me. You're in the hospital. Your daughter is alive. Breathe with me. The injured father tried to lift his head. My girl. Maggie placed one firm hand on his shoulder. She is talking. That is our favorite sound. His breathing hitched, then slowed. For the next 20 minutes, Blackstone looked like the hospital on its brochures. Competent. Fast. Human. Even Vance, when he finally entered the trauma bay, performed with chilling skill. He assessed the fracture-ordered imaging, checked distal pulses, and spoke to the patient with a polished authority that reassured everyone who did not know how quickly that authority could turn. When the immediate crisis passed, Sophie found Maggie rinsing blood from her forearm at a sink. He was good in there, Sophie said quietly. Maggie shut off the water. He is often good when the problem is obvious. That sounded almost generous. It was accurate. Sophie leaned against the doorframe, then lowered her voice. Why does everyone protect him? Maggie dried her arm with paper towels. Because he makes money, wins awards, and scares people just enough to keep them useful. That is it. No, Maggie said. Because sometimes he saves someone. And once a person has seen a doctor save a life, they have trouble believing he could cost one. Sophie absorbed that. Down the hall, Elaine Mercer appeared in a cream-colored coat despite the weather, her hair smooth, her posture perfect. She walked beside Dr. Pierce, speaking softly. They paused outside the physician lounge where Vance stood with a coffee. The three of them made a clean triangle. Surgery, administration, executive medicine. Maggie watched through the reflection in a darkened monitor. Mercer handed Vance a folder. Vance opened it, frowned, and said something Maggie could not hear. Pierce placed a hand on Vance's shoulder, not comforting, guiding. Mercer glanced toward the nurse's station. Her eyes landed on Maggie for less than a second. Then the triangle broke apart. Sophie followed Maggie's gaze. What was that about? Something they do not want discussed at the station. That could be anything. Exactly. Maggie walked back to her desk and checked the board again. The waiting room was filling. Flu symptoms, chest tightness, abdominal pain, one elderly woman with confusion, two veterans waiting for evaluation because the VA clinic had closed early due to weather. Blackstone loved veterans during fundraising season. On nights like this, they became names in a queue. Her phone buzzed in her scrub pocket. She stepped into a quieter alcove and looked at the screen. Caleb Walker. For a moment, the hard lines in her face eased. She answered, "You are calling late." His voice came through warm but tired. "So, are you working late? Or is this one of those shifts where time becomes theoretical?" "Both." Caleb exhaled. She could hear papers moving in the background. Washington never slept either. Not really. "You eat today. Do not start." "That means no." "That means I am not one of your witnesses." "No, you are worse. Witnesses sometimes answer questions." Maggie looked through the glass toward the ER. Sophie was helping Lena from registration with paperwork for another patient. Carla was arguing with bed control. Vance was nowhere in sight. Caleb's tone changed. "Mom." She heard it before he said anything else. The shift from son to official. "Careful. Heavy." "What?" "I saw a preliminary brief today. Your hospital's name came across my desk." Maggie went still. "What kind of brief?" "I cannot discuss details." "Then why are you telling me?" "Because if there is something happening there, you need to use proper reporting channels. Not me. Not a family call. Official channels." Maggie stared at a drop of rain sliding down the window. "You think I do not know that? I think you know it better than anyone. I also think you protect people until it costs you too much." She gave a quiet laugh with no humor in it. "You are becoming very Washington, and you are still deflecting." A paramedic unit rolled past the glass doors outside, lights flashing in the rain. Caleb lowered his voice. "If you have concerns, document legally. Report legally." Do not take records. Do not let anyone corner you into a conversation without representation. And if retaliation begins, you do not wait. Maggie closed her eyes for 1 second. You sound like your father. No, Dad would have told you to quit and move to Vermont. That got the smallest smile from her. Her husband had been gone 6 years, but Caleb still brought him into rooms gently, like setting down something fragile. He hated cold weather, Maggie said. He hated hospitals more. The smile faded. For a while, neither spoke. Then Caleb said, I am not asking as the Attorney General. I know. I am asking as your son. Maggie watched Sophie laugh nervously at something Carla said, young and exhausted and still hopeful in a way Blackstone had not yet beaten out of her. I can handle my floor, Maggie said. That is what worries me. You always think the floor is yours to hold. A call light flashed red above room 9. Maggie straightened. I have to go. Mom. What? If your gut says something is wrong, listen to it before someone with a better title talks you out of it. The line stayed open a breath longer than necessary. Then Maggie ended the call. She stood in the alcove with the phone in her hand, Caleb's warning settling into the part of her mind where old battlefield instructions lived. Do not cluster near fuel trucks. Do not trust sudden quiet. Do not ignore the medic who says a man looks wrong, even if the numbers are still pretty. When she returned to the station, Sophie was waiting with 2 charts. Room 9 has chest discomfort, but he says it is probably indigestion. Registration just entered him. Maggie took the chart automatically, but another alarm sounded before she could open it. The elderly woman in room 4 had pulled out her IV. A child began vomiting in triage. Bed control called back with no available surgical rooms. The department swallowed the moment whole. For the next hour, Maggie moved from patient to patient, from one small fire to another, carrying Caleb's voice under the surface. Use proper reporting channels. She had tried. 3 months earlier, she had filed a safety concern after a patient with sepsis waited too long for antibiotics because Vance refused to change the diagnosis from viral illness. The patient survived after ICU transfer. Maggie's report came back marked, reviewed, no deviation from standard care. 2 months earlier, Carla filed a concern after a medication dose was entered incorrectly and nearly administered to a child. The nurse who caught it was thanked privately and warned publicly about charting tone. 6 weeks earlier, Daniel Brooks from pharmacy vanished from the schedule. Officially, he resigned. Unofficially, he had argued with Dr. Pierce about controlled medication discrepancies and adverse event classifications. His locker was cleaned out before anyone saw him leave. Blackstone did not explode when something went wrong. It absorbed the blast and painted over the walls. At 12:11 a.m., Maggie stepped into the supply room to restock IV kits. Sophie followed with a box of saline flushes. Can I ask you something personal? Number. Okay, Sophie said. Can I ask anyway? Maggie almost smiled. 1 question. Why did you leave the army? Maggie placed the IV kits into a drawer 1 by 1. I did my time. That is the official answer. That is the answer. Sophie waited. The supply room hummed with fluorescent light. Somewhere outside, a monitor alarm started and stopped. Maggie finally said, There was a boy in Kandahar, 19. He kept asking if his mother had been called. He was not my son, but for 20 minutes he sounded like him. Sophie's face changed. We saved him, Maggie said. That was the problem. I do not understand. If he had died, I could have put the grief somewhere. But he lived, and I realized I had been holding my breath for 22 years. She closed the drawer. I came home because I thought civilian hospitals would feel less like war. Do they? Maggie looked at the closed supply room door. On the other side, Blackstone moved and groaned and hid its wounds under policy. Sometimes, she said, the uniforms are different. Before Sophie could answer, the radio at the charge desk crackled again. The dispatcher's voice came through thin and distorted by weather. Walk in, arriving now. Male, early 60s, chest pressure, pale diaphoretic. Wife, transporting by private vehicle. They are at your entrance. Maggie was already moving. By the time she reached triage, the automatic doors were sliding open. A woman in a rain-dark coat stepped in, first one hand raised, as if she had been trying to hold the world together by force. Beside her, a gray-faced man in a soaked army cap tried to stand straight and failed. His hand was pressed against the center of his chest. Maggie saw his skin, his breathing the sweat along his temple, and the careful way he tried to smile so his wife would not be afraid. Her pulse did not quicken. Her voice cut clean through the noise. Wheelchair, monitor, now. Maggie reached him before the wheelchair did. The man in the soaked army cap had one hand on the wall and the other pressed to his sternum. Not dramatically. Not like people did in training videos, but with the quiet embarrassment of someone who thought pain was a private matter. His knees dipped once. His wife grabbed his sleeve with both hands. "Tom," she said, her voice cracking, "stop pretending. I'm standing, Lena. You're leaning." Maggie stepped in close, calm enough that the woman looked at her like she had just found solid ground. "Sir, I'm Maggie Walker. I'm going to put you in this chair." The man tried to smile. Rainwater dripped from the brim of his cap onto his gray cheek. "I walked in. I can make it another 20 feet. Maggie slid one hand behind his shoulder and guided him down as Sophie rolled the chair into place. "You already made it 20 feet too far." He gave a breath that might have been a laugh if it had not caught halfway through. Lena looked at Maggie. He said it was heartburn. Then he said maybe he pulled something moving boxes. Then he got pale in the car. Tom closed his eyes. "I am right here, and I am scared right here," Lena snapped, but her anger was only fear wearing a sharper uniform. Maggie touched 2 fingers to Tom's wrist. His pulse was fast, uneven, and too thin beneath the skin. She looked at Sophie. Room 9. Cardiac monitor. 12 lead EKG. Full vitals. Paige Vance. Sophie moved before the sentence finished. Tom's eyes opened. "Vance. Doctor on tonight," Maggie said. He studied her face with the practiced habit of an old officer reading the person giving orders. "You military. Army nurse. Retired. Branch still counts," he murmured. "Then you know how this works. I give instructions. You follow them." His mouth twitched again. "Rank. Major." He let his head rest against the wheelchair. "Then I outrank you." Maggie pushed him toward the treatment room. "Not in my ER." Lena followed so closely she nearly stepped on the back wheels. The waiting room blurred around them, full of coughing children, tired parents, and old men with folded jackets in their laps. No one understood that a line had just been crossed. A man had entered the building under his own power, and Maggie's instincts were already telling her he might not leave that way unless someone moved fast. Room 9 was narrow, cold, and too bright. Sophie helped Tom onto the bed while Maggie cut away the damp collar of his shirt. Tom protested once, then stopped when the effort made his face tighten. "Pressure," Maggie asked. Sophie wrapped the cuff around his arm. 148/92, she said. Pulse 118. Oxygen 94. Maggie placed electrodes across Tom's chest, each movement crisp and familiar. Pain level. Tom stared at the ceiling. Not pain, pressure. "Where?" He tapped the center of his chest with 2 fingers. "Here. Feels like someone parked a truck on me." Lena made a small sound. Maggie looked at Tom's left hand. It was flexing, then relaxing. "Any pain in your arm, jaw, back?" Tom hesitated. Little ache in the jaw. "Arm feels strange. Could be from driving." "Could be," Maggie said, but her eyes had already changed. The printer on the EKG machine began to chatter. A strip of paper slid out covered in jagged black truth. Maggie tore it free and read it quickly. It was not the screaming pattern that made television doctors run. It was quieter than that. A whisper at the edge of disaster. Changes that could be explained away by someone who wanted an easy answer. Maggie did not want an easy answer. Sophie leaned in. "Is it bad?" Maggie kept her voice low. "It is enough." Lena gripped the bed rail. "Enough for what?" Maggie turned to her. "Enough that we take this seriously." Tom swallowed. "I had spicy food at dinner." Maggie looked down at him. "Colonel, I need you to stop helping the wrong side of the argument." Major, he corrected. Major Keene, then take the order. Lena blinked at him. You were a major, retired Tom said. You told the church group you were a colonel. I rounded up. For one brief second the room breathed. Then the monitor alarmed. Tom's heart rhythm stumbled across the screen. His blood pressure cuff began another cycle. Maggie watched the numbers fall. 102/64, Sophie said. Lena's face drained. That is lower. Yes, Maggie said. Sophie, start an IV. 16 gauge if you can get it. Draw cardiac enzymes, CBCCMP coag studies. Call lab for priority pickup. Sophie nodded, but her hand paused near the drawer. Vance has not seen him yet. Maggie's eyes did not leave the monitor. The patient has seen him first. The door swung open before Sophie could answer. Dr. Preston Vance entered with a paper cup of coffee in one hand and irritation already set into his face. He looked at Tom, then at the monitor, then at Maggie. He did not look at Lena. What is this? Maggie handed him the EKG strip. Thomas Keene, 61. Chest pressure, diaphoresis, jaw, discomfort, left arm symptoms unstable, blood pressure, abnormal rhythm. Needs cardiac workup and repeat EKG. Vance glanced at the strip like it had interrupted something more important. How long since onset? Tom tried to answer, but Lena spoke first. About 2 hours, maybe 3. He did not want to come. Vance gave her the thin smile doctors used when they had already decided a family member was anxious. Most chest discomfort is not cardiac. Maggie stood at the foot of the bed. This one needs to be treated like it is until proven otherwise. Vance's eyes lifted. I will decide that. Tom looked between them, his breathing shallow. Vance walked to the bedside and placed 2 fingers against Tom's wrist. He listened to his chest for less than 10 seconds. Any history of anxiety? Tom frowned. Number. Reflux. Sometimes. Recent stress. Lena let out a sharp laugh. He is retired. He builds birdhouses. Tom looked wounded. They are not just birdhouses. Vance ignored that. Likely reflux with anxiety component. Give GI cocktail fluids basic labs. If initial troponin is clean and symptoms improve, discharge with follow-up. Maggie did not move. He needs serial enzymes and cardiology consult. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Vance turned slowly. Excuse me. His pressure is unstable. Symptoms fit cardiac presentation. This EKG is not clean. It is nonspecific. It is concerning. To you. To the patient's body. Lena looked at Maggie with desperate attention as if every word might become permission to be afraid. Vance stepped closer, his voice lower. You do not diagnose in my department. I am not diagnosing. I am escalating. You are contradicting a physician in front of a patient. I am advocating in front of one. Tom closed his eyes, sweat gathering at his temple. Vance smiled. It was the same smile from the nurse's station, sharpened now by an audience. Major Walker, your combat background does not make every chest complaint a mass casualty event. Maggie did not blink. No, it makes me listen when the body starts withdrawing from the fight. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Vance looked at Sophie. Carry out my orders. Sophie's face went pale. Yes, doctor. Vance placed the EKG strip on the counter without signing it. And Maggie, he said, turning at the door. You will chart my assessment accurately. Not your imagination. The door closed behind him. The room felt smaller after he left. Lena stepped forward. Is my husband having a heart attack? Maggie looked at Tom, then back at Lena. She chose every word carefully. I am concerned that his symptoms may be cardiac. I believe he needs further evaluation. That is not what he said. Number. Can we ask for another doctor? Maggie heard Sophie stop opening the IV package. You have the right to request another evaluation, Maggie said. You also have the right to transfer care if you do not feel safe. Tom opened his eyes. Transfer, we just got here. Maggie moved to his side. Sir, how is the pressure now? His jaw tightened. Worse. Any nausea? He gave a tiny nod. Lena, he whispered. His wife leaned over him. I'm here. He tried to lift his right hand toward her, but the movement stalled. His eyes lost focus for half a second. The monitor screamed. Sophie moved first, then looked at Maggie for confirmation. BP 88/52. Maggie's voice cut through the alarm. Tom, look at me. His eyes fluttered. Tom. He found her face. There you are. Stay with my voice. Sophie reached for the crash cart. Should I call Vance back? Yes, Maggie said. And call Memorial Heights Cardiology. Sophie froze. What? Now. Lena turned to Maggie. What is Memorial Heights? A hospital with interventional cardiology available tonight. You mean another hospital? Yes. The alarm kept pulsing. Tom's breathing became shallow and fast. Sophie grabbed the phone with shaking fingers. Vance answered on the third ring. Sophie's voice was barely steady. Dr. Vance, room 9 is deteriorating. Pressure is 88/52. Nurse Walker is requesting you return. A pause. Sophie's eyes flicked to Maggie. He says, give fluids and reassess. Maggie took the phone. Dr. Vance, this patient needs immediate cardiac escalation. His voice came through loud enough for Sophie to hear. You were given orders. He is hypotensive. Then support pressure. He may be infarcting. You are not qualified to make that call. Maggie looked at Tom's gray face, at Lena's trembling hands, at Sophie standing between fear and duty. No, Maggie said. But I am qualified to recognize when waiting is dangerous. Vance's voice dropped. If you go around me, Walker, you will regret it. Maggie ended the call. Sophie stared at her. He is going to destroy you. Maggie placed the receiver down. Get me Memorial Heights. The next minutes moved with strange clarity. Maggie spoke to the cardiology transfer coordinator, then to an on-call cardiologist named Dr. Aaron Bell, who had worked with her years earlier during a mass casualty training exercise. She gave vital symptoms, EKG findings, and the fact that the attending physician had declined further cardiac escalation. She did not embellish. She did not ask Bell to save her. She asked him to receive a patient. Bell's voice changed halfway through the report. Send him. Lena signed the transfer request with a hand that shook so badly Maggie had to steady the clipboard. Am I doing the right thing? Lena whispered. Maggie looked at Tom, who was trying to hide how frightened he was. You are getting him to a higher level of cardiac care. That is not what I asked. Maggie held her gaze. Yes, I believe you are doing the right thing. Sophie prepared the transfer packet while looking over her shoulder every few seconds. Maggie documented everything. Times, vitals, physician notified, patient condition, wife request, receiving physician acceptance. No opinion, no anger, just facts laid down like sandbags against a flood. Paramedics arrived through the bay doors with rain on their shoulders. One of them, a broad man named Harlan, looked at Tom and then at Maggie. Where are we going? Memorial Heights. Direct to emergency receiving cardiology aware. Harlan glanced at the chart. Blackstone transferring cardiac. Maggie met his eyes. Patient requested transfer. He understood enough not to ask the next question in front of the family. They moved Tom onto the transport stretcher. Lena walked beside him holding his hand. As they passed the nurse's station, Dr. Vance appeared at the end of the hall. His face was no longer irritated. It was furious. Stop that stretcher. No one moved for half a second. Maggie stepped into the center of the hall. The patient has requested transfer. Receiving physician has accepted. Vance walked toward her. I did not authorize this. Your refusal and continued orders are documented. His eyes flicked toward the paramedics, the family, the nurses watching from rooms and doorways. You are practicing medicine without a license. I am following patient transfer rights and nursing escalation standards. Vance's voice became soft, which made it worse. You think paperwork protects you? Maggie did not answer. Behind her, Tom lifted his head weakly. Doctor, he said. Vance looked past Maggie. Tom's voice shook, but the old officer was still inside it. My wife wants the transfer, so do I. Vance's expression shifted for one brief second. Not guilt. Calculation. Lena stepped closer to the stretcher. Please let us go. The hallway held its breath. Vance stepped aside. The paramedics rolled Tom through the ambulance bay doors into the rain. Lena climbed in after him. Maggie followed to the threshold and watched Harlan secure the rear doors. Through the small ambulance window, Tom looked back at her. He raised 2 fingers from the blanket in a weak salute. Maggie returned it. The ambulance pulled away, red lights bleeding across the wet pavement. For a few seconds, the sound of the siren faded into the storm. Sophie stood beside Maggie in the open bay, her face pale. Was that legal? Maggie watched the lights disappear. It was necessary. That is not the same thing. No, Maggie said, it is not. Inside, the ER had not stopped. People still coughed, monitors still beeped. Someone laughed nervously behind a curtain because fear sometimes escaped that way. The hospital continued pretending the world had not shifted. Maggie walked back to room 9 and cleaned the space herself. She stripped the bed, discarded tubing, wiped the rail where Tom's hand had gripped too hard. On the floor near the bed, she found his army cap. Dark blue rain soaked with a faded patch on the front. She picked it up and held it for a moment. Sophie appeared in the doorway. Memorial Heights just called the desk. They arrived. Maggie nodded. They said he went straight to cath lab. Maggie closed her eyes once, then opened them. Good. Sophie waited for more, but Maggie had none to give. Relief was dangerous before the work was done. 29 minutes later, the call came. Sophie answered, listened, and turned slowly toward Maggie. Her voice was almost a whisper. Dr. Bell says 95% blockage. Left anterior descending. They placed a stent. Maggie leaned one hand against the counter. For the first time all night, the muscles in her face loosened. Sophie swallowed. He said if Tom had gone home, he probably would not have survived. No one around them spoke. Carla stood frozen near the medication room. Pete looked down at the floor. Even the patient in room 6 had stopped complaining. Maggie took the message slip from Sophie and placed it into the charting queue. Document the receiving update. Sophie stared at her. That is all. That is the job. But you were right. Maggie looked down the hall where Dr. Vance had vanished behind a closed door. In this building, being right is when the fight starts. The physician lounge door opened. Vance stepped out slowly, phone in hand, his expression carved from something colder than anger. Dr. Pierce was behind him. Elaine Mercer had arrived, too, coat still perfect, eyes already measuring damage. Vance walked straight toward Maggie. The ER seemed to narrow around him. Maggie set Tom Keene's cap on the counter brim, facing forward, rain still dripping from the edge. Then she turned to meet the doctor whose patient was alive because she had refused to obey him. Maggie turned to meet him, and for one quiet second, the entire emergency department seemed to hold its breath with her. Dr. Preston Vance crossed the floor without hurry. That was the first sign of how angry he was. When Vance was annoyed, he snapped. When he was inconvenienced, he barked. But when his power had been challenged in front of nurses, paramedics, and a patient's wife, he became very still, very precise, and very dangerous. Dr. Pierce followed several steps behind him, hands folded at his waist. Elaine Mercer stood near the glass doors to the administrative corridor, watching the scene the way someone might watch a spill spread across an expensive rug. Vance stopped close enough that Maggie could smell coffee on his breath. "Where is my patient?" Maggie's voice stayed level. Thomas Keene was transferred to Memorial Heights under patient request and physician acceptance. "I did not ask for your legal fantasy. I asked where he is." "In cath lab." The words landed harder than either of them expected. Vance's eyes changed. Behind the anger was calculation, and behind calculation was fear. Not fear for Tom Keene, fear of the chart, fear of the phone call, fear of the sentence that was already traveling through the hospital like electricity. The nurse was right. Maggie saw it cross his face and vanish. "You transferred a patient behind my back." The patient and his wife requested transfer after being informed of his condition. "You manipulated them." "No. I told them what you refused to take seriously." The nearest monitor beeped 3 times. No one moved to silence it. Vance stepped closer. "You think you saved him?" Maggie held his stare. "I think he is alive." That did it. Vance grabbed her upper arm and drove her backward into the supply room door. The metal handle struck her shoulder blade. A tray rattled on the counter beside them. Sophie, standing near the medication cart, flinched so hard the scanner almost slipped from her hand. Vance lowered his voice, but the rage in it filled the hall. "You just signed the death certificate on your career." Maggie did not look at his hand. She looked at his face. "Move your hand, doctor. You think because you patched up soldiers in tents you can overrule me in my emergency room. I think a man almost died while you protected your pride." His grip tightened. Carla took one step forward, then stopped when Dr. Pierce looked at her. It was not a threat in the usual sense. Pierce did not need to glare. He only had to notice her. That was enough to remind every nurse in the hallway that mortgages, licenses, references, and reputations could all be made fragile. Sophie stood frozen, her chest rising fast. Her right hand lowered toward the pocket of her scrub top. Her phone was there. She had started recording when Vance crossed the floor. She did not know why at first. Maybe because Maggie had once told her that if the room was lying, the record should not. Vance leaned closer. "I will bury your license. I will make sure no hospital in Colorado hires you to clean bedpans." Maggie's voice was almost quiet. "You are threatening a nurse for preventing a fatal discharge. I am disciplining an insubordinate employee who endangered a patient. The patient is in cath lab because you would not call cardiology." Vance released her with a shove. "You are done." Elaine Mercer finally moved. She approached as if she had not just watched a surgeon put his hands on a nurse in the middle of an emergency department. "Maggie," she said, soft and polished. "We need to step into conference room B." Maggie rubbed her arm once, not because she wanted them to see it hurt, but because she wanted to remember exactly where his fingers had been. "I am still charge nurse on this shift." "Not anymore," Mercer said. The department remained silent. Maggie looked at Carla. "Room 6 needs reassessment in 10. Room 4 is fall risk. The child in triage needs fluids if he vomits again." Carla swallowed. "I have it." Maggie picked up Tom Keen's soaked army cap from the counter and placed it on the empty chair beside the desk. Then she followed Mercer down the hallway. Conference room B had glass walls, a polished table, and a framed photograph of Blackstone's leadership team smiling beneath a banner that read, "Community Trust Award." Maggie sat without being invited. Vance remained standing. Dr. Pierce took the chair across from her. Mercer placed a folder on the table and folded her hands on top of it. The room smelled faintly of lemon cleaner. Mercer began. "Maggie, tonight's incident represents a serious breach of protocol." Maggie looked at her. "Then, this should be easy to review. Pull the vitals, timestamps, call logs, and transfer acceptance." Pierce gave her a sympathetic smile. "That is exactly the kind of combativeness we have been concerned about. Clinical facts are not combativeness. Your pattern of behavior suggests difficulty adjusting to collaborative civilian practice." Maggie leaned back slightly. "You are calling patient advocacy a military defect." No one said that, Mercer replied. "You are building toward it." Vance laughed once under his breath. "Do you hear yourself? This is why people do not like working with you." Maggie turned to him. "People who endanger patients rarely enjoy witnesses." Mercer opened the folder. "Effective immediately, your employment with Blackstone Regional Medical Center is terminated pending final administrative review." She slid the papers across the table. "Reason for termination: gross insubordination. Unauthorized patient transfer. Disruption of medical chain of command. Potential patient endangerment." Maggie read every line slowly. Then she looked up. "Potential patient endangerment." Pierce removed his glasses and cleaned them with a cloth. "You acted outside the scope of nursing judgment. I escalated a deteriorating patient to an accepting physician at a facility equipped to treat him." Vance's hands curled at his sides. "You went around the attending of record, and the patient survived." Mercer's expression hardened. "That outcome does not excuse process violations." "No," Maggie said, "but it does make your wording look desperate." Pierce replaced his glasses. "You should consider signing the separation acknowledgement." It will help with any future licensing questions. Maggie looked down at the paper. There it was, the quiet trap. A signature that could become consent. A sentence that could become confession. A phrase that could become the hospital's version of truth. She pushed the folder back. I am signing nothing tonight. Mercer's smile returned smaller now. That is your choice. No, it is my documentation. For a moment, Vance looked ready to explode again. Pierce stood first. Security will escort you to your locker. Maggie rose. I need my personal property, including my phone bag and jacket. I will not access patient areas without escort. I will not discuss patient details in public spaces. I will document this meeting while a memory is fresh. Pierce blinked once. Mercer said, You are not permitted to contact Blackstone staff regarding this incident. Maggie paused at the door. If staff contact investigators, that will be their choice. Mercer's face changed so slightly most people would have missed it. Maggie did not. Security walked her through the back corridor, not the main ER. That was Mercer's style. Remove the problem without letting the building see the removal. But hospitals had eyes. A radiology tech watched from an elevator. A janitor slowed near the linen carts. A respiratory therapist looked down at the floor as Maggie passed, then whispered, I am sorry. Maggie did not answer. If she answered, she might have felt it. At her locker, she opened the door and stared at the old trauma shears wrapped in the white towel. For the first time in years, she wanted to take them out and feel their weight. Instead, she placed them carefully into her bag. She added her jacket, her water bottle, a small notebook, and a protein bar she had forgotten to eat 10 hours earlier. Sophie appeared at the end of the locker row. The security guard turned. She cannot be here. Sophie's face was pale, but she held her ground. I am getting my coat. Maggie looked at her and knew at once. Sophie had something. Fear was written all over the girl, but under it was decision. The guard looked bored and tired. Make it quick. Sophie opened the locker beside Maggie's. Her hands shook as she pulled out a gray coat. Without looking over, she whispered, I recorded him. Maggie kept her face still. Do not send it to anyone inside this hospital. I do not know what to do. Save it somewhere safe. Do not edit it. Do not post it. Do not talk about it on the floor. Sophie swallowed. They will fire me. Maggie zipped her bag. Maybe. Sophie looked like the word had hit her in the chest. Maggie softened. But if you keep the original, they cannot make what happened disappear. The security guard cleared his throat. Time. Maggie walked out through the employee exit into the parking garage. The rain had found its way through cracks in the concrete and dripped in steady cold lines between parked cars. Her truck sat under a flickering light. For a while, she stood beside it without opening the door. Only then did her arm begin to ache. She pulled out her phone. There were 3 missed calls from Caleb. She did not call him first. She opened a note and wrote down the time of every event she could remember. Tom's arrival, first vitals, first EKG, Vance's assessment, blood pressure drop, call to Vance, transfer request, acceptance from Memorial Heights, ambulance departure, cath lab confirmation, Vance's physical contact, termination meeting, facts first, feelings later. Then she sent one message to Caleb. Blackstone, active retaliation, patient near miss, possible pattern. I am safe. The response came almost immediately. Do not speak to hospital counsel. Preserve your notes. Use the hotline I gave you. I am recusing from any direct contact. Maggie stared at the words. He had not asked if she was exaggerating. He had not told her to calm down. He knew better. She found the number written in the back of her notebook. A federal patient safety and healthcare fraud reporting line. Caleb had given it to her months ago during one of their careful conversations, the kind where he spoke like an official, because speaking like a son would have hurt too much. She called. A woman answered on the 4th ring. Federal Healthcare Integrity Intake. This line is recorded. Are you reporting immediate patient danger fraud retaliation or obstruction? Maggie closed her eyes against the fluorescent buzz of the garage light. All of the above. The intake specialist did not sound surprised. Name: Megan Walker. Registered nurse. Former employee as of tonight. Blackstone Regional Medical Center, Colorado Springs. There was a pause. A keyboard clicked. Please remain on the line. Maggie opened her eyes. The rain kept falling. When Agent Rachel Monroe received the intake alert, she was not in bed. She was in a federal office 2 time zones away, sitting under a desk lamp with a cold cup of coffee and a stack of files that all carried the same hospital name. Blackstone Regional had been on a quiet review list for 7 months. At first, the file looked financial. Medicare billing irregularities. Unusual coding patterns. High reimbursement claims tied to trauma consults. Then veteran care complaints began appearing. Then family settlement reports. Then anonymous staff allegations about altered safety reviews. It was not enough. Not yet. Hospitals made mistakes. Billing systems were messy. Families grieving a death sometimes demanded answers medicine could not give. Anonymous complaints could come from angry employees. Rachel Monroe knew all of that. She also knew patterns had a smell, and Blackstone's file had begun to stink. Her analyst stepped into the doorway. New intake from Blackstone. Rachel looked up. Anonymous. Number: named nurse, former Army. Fired tonight after transferring a deteriorating cardiac patient. Receiving hospital placed a stent. Patient survived. Rachel stood so quickly her chair rolled backward. Did she mention retaliation? Termination? Threats? Physical contact by physician? Possible witness recording? Rachel reached for her jacket. We do not have smoke anymore. The analyst grabbed his laptop. Rachel picked up the Blackstone folder. We have flame. By dawn, Blackstone's legal department received the first federal preservation notice. It did not accuse. It did not explain. It simply ordered the hospital to preserve records, communications audit, trails, transfer logs, adverse event reports, internal complaints, personnel records, surveillance footage, and electronic medical metadata connected to specified categories of patient safety events. Elaine Mercer read the notice twice in her office while the sun rose gray over the mountains. Dr. Pierce stood by the window. Vance paced. "This is Walker Vance," said. Mercer did not look up. "This is bigger than Walker." Vance stopped. "What does that mean?" Pierce answered quietly. "It means someone was already looking." Mercer pressed the intercom button. "Get legal on the line, now." By 7:15, every department head had received an urgent meeting invite. By 7:40, staff were told not to discuss the Keene incident, not to speculate, not to communicate with former employees, and not to release internal information to outside parties without authorization. The memo used the phrase patient privacy 6 times. It did not use the phrase federal investigation once. Carla read it at the nurse's station and felt her stomach twist. Sophie read it in the staff bathroom, with the stall door locked, her phone clutched against her chest. The video sat in her cloud storage under a file name that meant nothing to anyone but her. She played the first 3 seconds. Vance's voice filled the tiny bathroom. "You just signed the death certificate on your career." Sophie stopped the video and covered her mouth. Across town at Memorial Heights, Tom Keene woke beneath softer lights than Blackstone's. His chest hurt, but differently now, cleanly, mechanically, like the aftermath of repair rather than the approach of disaster. Lena sat beside him, still wearing the sweater she had slept in his dog tags wrapped around her wrist. Tom blinked. "Did I miss dinner?" Lena laughed and cried at the same time. "You almost missed everything." A cardiologist entered, introduced himself as Dr. Bell, and explained what had happened. 95% blockage. Emergency intervention. Good response, close call. Tom listened without interrupting. Then he said, "How close?" Dr. Bell looked at Lena, then back at him. "If you had gone home, I do not believe you would have survived the night." Lena pressed his dog tags against her mouth. Tom turned his head toward the window. The morning sky was pale and washed clean by rain. The nurse knew, he said. Yes, Dr. Bell replied. She did. Later, when Lena called Maggie, the former nurse was sitting at her kitchen table in silence, still wearing the black undershirt from her shift. Her scrubs were folded in the laundry room because she could not stand the smell of Blackstone on them. Maggie answered. Mrs. Keene. Lena's voice broke on the first word. He is alive. Maggie closed her eyes. I am glad. They said he would have died. Maggie said nothing. You saved my husband. Maggie looked at the old trauma shears lying on the table beside her notebook. I did what any nurse should have been allowed to do. Lena cried quietly. I do not know how to thank you. Stay with him. Write down everything you remember. Times, names, words used. Do not sign anything from Blackstone without counsel. The line went quiet. You think they will contact us? Yes. Lena inhaled shakily. Then we will be ready. After the call, Maggie finally allowed her hands to tremble, only for a moment. Then she wrote Lena's words into her notes. By afternoon, Agent Monroe called. Her voice was calm, direct, and tired in a way Maggie recognized. Ms. Walker, I am Special Agent Rachel Monroe. I need to ask you a series of questions. Before I do, are you safe? Maggie looked at the blinds covering her front window. Yes. Are you alone? Yes. Do you have counsel? Not yet. I recommend you obtain counsel before a formal interview. For now, I am confirming intake details and immediate preservation concerns. Did anyone at Blackstone instruct you to alter, omit, or soften documentation? Maggie thought of Mercer's language alignment meetings, Pierce's gentle warnings, Vance's demand that she chart his assessment, not her imagination. Yes, she said, not just tonight. Agent Monroe paused. How long has this been going on? Maggie looked at the notebook in front of her, long enough that I started writing down report numbers. That evening, the first crack opened from inside. Daniel Brooks, former Blackstone pharmacist, called the federal line after hearing from an old coworker that agents were asking about records. He had kept copies of his own complaints, not patient files, but reports he had authored and responses he had received. Dose overrides, delayed medication reconciliation, controlled substance discrepancies, adverse drug events downgraded before review. He told Agent Monroe they did not fix the system. They fixed the paperwork. By nightfall, Heather Mallory called too. Her husband had died at Blackstone 8 months earlier, after stroke symptoms were dismissed as dehydration and stress. She had signed a settlement she barely understood while still so grief-stunned she could not remember driving home from the lawyer's office. She had believed because they told her to believe that medicine was complicated and blame was a stage of grief. Then she saw an online post from a veteran group asking if anyone had concerns about Blackstone care. She called with a shaking voice and said, I think they lied to me about my husband. Agent Monroe's team began building a wall of names, dates, reports, and silence. Inside, Blackstone Mercer moved faster. She held a leadership meeting in the executive boardroom. No phones allowed. Dr. Pierce presented a controlled narrative. Dr. Vance insisted Maggie had acted recklessly. Legal counsel advised unified language. Communications drafted a statement before any reporter called. Mercer stood at the head of the table. The priority is institutional stability. A nursing director asked carefully, What about staff concerns? Mercer looked at her. Staff concerns become patient harm when they are handled irresponsibly. No one else asked a question. That night, Sophie sat in her apartment with the lights off, listening to the video again. Her thumb hovered over Agent Monroe's secure upload link. She thought of Vance's hand on Maggie's arm. She thought of Tom Keene's gray face. She thought of every time she had stayed quiet because quiet felt safer. Then she uploaded the file. At 9:26 p.m., Agent Monroe watched the video in a conference room with 2 prosecutors and a forensic analyst. Vance's voice filled the room. You think because you patched up soldiers in a desert tent you can overrule me in my emergency room. The analyst looked up. Original file? No visible edits. One prosecutor leaned back. That is not discipline. That is retaliation. Agent Monroe watched Maggie on the screen, standing with her back against the supply room door, calm under threat, eyes fixed on the man trying to erase her. "No," Rachel said. "That is the first thing they failed to bury." The following morning, Blackstone Regional Medical Center released a public statement. Maggie stood in her kitchen as the local news anchor read it aloud. Blackstone Regional remains committed to the highest standards of patient care. Recent claims by a former employee involve a personnel matter and do not reflect the dedication of our physicians, nurses, and staff. Due to patient privacy laws, we cannot comment on specific cases. We are cooperating with all appropriate inquiries. Then Elaine Mercer appeared at a podium outside the hospital entrance framed by flags and glass. "We must be careful," Mercer said, "not to let one disgruntled former employee damage trust in a hospital that has served this community with honor." Maggie turned off the television. Her phone rang almost immediately. "Agent Monroe. They just made this public," Rachel said. Maggie looked through the window at the mountains beyond the rooftops, sharp and cold beneath a clearing sky. "Good." Rachel was silent for a beat. "Good." Maggie's picked up Tom Keen's cap from the chair beside her table. Lena had sent it back through a courier that morning with a note that said, "He wants you to keep it until he can thank you himself." Maggie held the cap in both hands. Now the other families know they were not crazy. Maggie held Tom Keen's cap until the fabric warmed under her fingers. Outside her kitchen window, Colorado Springs looked washed clean after the storm. The streets shone pale under the morning sun. Water clung to the branches of the blue spruce in her yard. Beyond the rooftops, the mountains stood hard and silent, their ridges cut against the sky like the edge of a blade. Inside the television screen was black. Elaine Mercer's words still hung in the room. "One disgruntled former employee." Maggie had heard men call artillery fire distant thunder. She had heard soldiers call fear fatigue. She had heard officers call preventable losses operational complications. Powerful people always had softer names for the damage they caused. Her phone vibrated again. This time it was Caleb. She let it ring twice before answering. "I saw the statement," he said. "I assumed. You need counsel. I know. You need security. I have locks. Mom." She heard the sun beneath the title. Beneath the Washington voice. Beneath all the careful distance he had built around the case because the law demanded it, and because he respected the law too much to bend it even for her. Maggie looked at the cap on the table. "They called me disgruntled." Caleb breathed out through his nose. "That means they are scared." "No, it means they are organized. Both can be true." A car passed slowly outside her house. Maggie turned her head and watched it through the narrow gap in the blinds. Dark sedan, tinted windows. It rolled past without stopping. Caleb's voice sharpened. "What is it?" "Nothing." You looked away from the phone. "You cannot see me." "I know you." The car reached the end of the street and turned right. Maggie let the blind fall back into place. "I am fine. That sentence has carried you through too many bad places." She almost smiled, but there was no room in her chest for it. "I am not your case, Caleb." "No," he said quietly. "You are my mother. That is worse." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Caleb said, "I formally recused myself from direct involvement this morning. Everything goes through the assigned teams. I will not receive privileged updates. I will not influence charging decisions. I cannot protect you from the process. I never asked you to. I know." His voice softened. "But I can tell you this as a son. Do not underestimate what they will do to survive." Maggie looked at the old trauma shears on the table beside her notebook. "I never do." Blackstone moved faster than grief. By noon, every local station had the story. A respected hospital under review. A fired combat nurse making allegations. A veteran patient transferred in the middle of the night. A surgeon accused of dismissing cardiac symptoms. A federal preservation notice. No one had all the facts, so everyone chose the facts that sounded most like what they already believed. A radio host called Maggie reckless before lunch. A veterans group demanded an independent investigation by 2. A hospital donor posted that Blackstone had saved his wife, and that one angry nurse should not be allowed to destroy a community institution. By late afternoon, someone leaked fragments from Maggie's personnel file. Not the praise from military supervisors, not the trauma training awards, not the handwritten notes from families. The leak carried only phrases that could be made ugly under studio lights, difficult with physician authority, rigid communication style, overly aggressive documentation habits, possible unresolved combat stress impacting workplace interactions. Maggie read the lines on her phone while standing at her sink rinsing a mug she had not used. The last phrase made her stop. Combat stress. They had reached into the place where she stored the dead and tried to make it evidence. For 1 second, she was not in her kitchen. She was back under canvas in a field hospital sand against her teeth rotor wash, shaking the surgical lights, a 19-year-old private gripping her wrist while she told him to stay awake. He had lived. Others had not. Their faces did not belong to Blackstone. Their names did not belong in a personnel strategy. Her hand tightened around the mug until it slipped and cracked against the sink. She did not notice the blood on her palm until the red mixed with water. The doorbell rang. Maggie wrapped her hand in a dish towel and stood still. The bell rang again. She crossed the kitchen, stayed to the side of the front window, and looked through the narrow angle of the curtain. Sophie Grant stood on the porch in a gray hoodie, arms folded tight against herself. Her eyes were swollen like she had cried in the car and then ordered herself to stop before stepping out. Maggie opened the door. "You should not be here." Sophie looked at the towel around Maggie's hand. "You are bleeding. I am aware. That is what people say when they are not handling it." Maggie stepped aside. Sophie entered and immediately looked around as if expecting federal agents to be hiding behind furniture. She seemed smaller outside the hospital, stripped of badge and scanner, and the constant noise that gave nurses a place to put their fear. "I uploaded the video," Sophie said. "I know. Agent Monroe called me." Maggie closed the door. "And?" She said they will need a formal statement. Maggie walked to the kitchen. "Then give one if you are ready." Sophie followed. "I am not ready." Maggie turned on the faucet and unwrapped her hand. "Then give one if you are telling the truth." Sophie watched her rinse the shallow cut. "They are saying I violated hospital policy by recording. They will say everything except what happened. My manager told me I should think about my future." Maggie dried her hand with paper towels. That was a threat. She said it like advice. The polished ones usually do. Sophie sat at the kitchen table, eyes landing on Tom's cap. "Is that his?" "Yes." "Is he okay?" "He is alive." Sophie pressed her lips together. That should be enough to make people understand. Maggie opened a drawer and took out a bandage. People understand what costs them least. The words settled between them. Sophie rubbed her hands over her knees. "I keep hearing him in the video. Vance, I keep thinking if I had not recorded it, they would all be calling you unstable, and there would be nothing to prove otherwise." Maggie wrapped the bandage around her palm. "That is why records matter. I was scared. You still did it." Sophie looked up. "I am not like you." "Good." The answer confused her. Maggie sat across from her. "You should not have to become hard to be honest. You should not need a war zone in your past to say a patient is in danger." Sophie's eyes filled again, but she did not look away. At the hospital, they make it feel like speaking up is betrayal. That is because they confuse the building with the mission. What is the mission? Maggie looked toward the dark television. The patient. Across town, Blackstone prepared for battle under softer lighting. The executive boardroom overlooked the city through glass walls. Elaine Mercer stood at the head of the table while communications staff arranged talking points in clean folders. Dr. Pierce sat with legal counsel. Vance stood near the window, arms crossed, his reflection staring back at him from the glass. A public relations consultant from Denver had arrived with a leather bag, a narrow smile, and the kind of voice that made panic sound strategic. "We need to separate the hospital from the individual incident," she said. "Blackstone is the community. Blackstone is veterans. Blackstone is access. The former nurse is instability, unilateral action, possible trauma response. Vance turned. She nearly killed him by delaying care. Dr. Pierce looked at him. That is not supported by the transfer record. Vance's jaw tightened. Then find a record that supports it. The room went quiet. Mercer's eyes moved slowly from Vance to legal counsel. No one is finding anything, she said. We are reviewing documentation for completeness. The attorney closed his folder. Do not use language like that again. Vance laughed once. You people are worried about language. I am the one being accused. Pierce folded his hands. You are not the only one exposed. Mercer leaned forward. Federal preservation means every email, every message, every audit trail. If anyone altered anything after notice, that becomes a separate problem. Vance looked out the window again. Walker did this. No, Mercer said. Walker survived long enough for it to surface. That was the first honest thing she had said all day. The next morning, the attacks widened. A television panel debated whether former military medical staff sometimes struggled with civilian hierarchy. A hospital-affiliated physician wrote an opinion piece warning against trial by media. Anonymous accounts online claimed Maggie had always wanted attention. One post said she had been fired for screaming at patients. Another said she had forged transfer consent. A third claimed Tom Keene was never in serious danger. Lena Keene saw that one from her husband's hospital room. Tom was asleep, his face less gray now, his breathing steady under a thin blanket. Lena sat beside him with her phone in both hands, reading, Strangers explain a night they had not lived. Her mouth hardened. She walked into the hallway and called Agent Monroe. I want to make a statement, she said. Agent Monroe did not rush her. Mrs. Keene, we can schedule a formal interview. No, I mean public. They are calling her a liar. We cannot direct public comments. I am not asking permission. That evening, Lena stood outside Memorial Heights with a local reporter holding a microphone near her face. She wore no makeup. Her eyes were tired. Tom's wedding ring hung on a chain around her neck because his hands were still swollen from the procedure. My husband walked into Blackstone with chest pressure, sweating, and pain in his jaw and arm, she said. Dr. Vance dismissed him. Nurse Walker listened. My husband is alive because she helped us leave. The reporter asked, Do you believe Blackstone is telling the truth? Lena looked directly into the camera. I believe they are telling the version where my husband is easier to erase. By morning, the clip had spread through veterans groups, nursing forums, and local community pages. The tide did not turn completely. It fractured. The clean story Blackstone wanted became harder to hold. Then Heather Mallory stepped forward. She had not planned to speak publicly. For 8 months after her husband Eric died, she had lived inside a silence paid for with a settlement check she had never cashed. The envelope sat in a drawer beneath dish towels, as if hiding it among ordinary things could make it less poisonous. Eric had been 49. A high school wrestling coach. Father of 2 daughters. He had arrived at Blackstone with slurred speech dizziness and weakness in his right hand. Heather had told 3 people he was not acting like himself. The chart called him dehydrated. Vance had written stress response. By the time a stroke was confirmed, the damage was catastrophic. Blackstone had told her it was tragic, but not preventable. Their lawyer had told her the agreement would protect her family from a long fight. For months, she believed grief had made her suspicious. Then she saw Maggie's face on television and recognized the shape of the lie. Heather met Agent Monroe in a federal office with no view and a box of tissues untouched between them. They said if I talked, it could affect the settlement, Heather said. Did they say it could affect your ability to learn what happened? Heather looked down at her hands. They said answers would not bring him back. Agent Monroe's voice stayed gentle. That is not the same thing. Heather brought copies of discharge summaries emails from hospital counsel and the NDA she had signed 2 days after burying her husband. She also brought a notebook Eric had used for wrestling practice. On the last page, one of their daughters had written, Dad promised to teach me how to drive. Rachel Monroe read that line twice and then closed the notebook carefully. The investigation expanded from one living patient to the dead. Daniel Brooks came next. He met the agents in a coffee shop first because he did not trust government buildings and had not trusted hospitals for almost a year. He was thin, nervous, and angry in a way that had burned past panic and settled into purpose. I was the night pharmacist, he said. I reported dosing overrides. I reported missing reconciliation. I reported adverse events being downgraded. Agent Monroe asked who received the reports. Pierce, Mercer's office, risk management. What happened? Daniel smiled without humor. They thanked me for my commitment to safety. And then, my badge stopped opening certain systems. My shifts changed. A controlled substance discrepancy appeared under my login. I was told resignation would look better than termination. He slid a flash drive across the table. These are my reports, my emails, their responses. I did not take patient charts. I took proof that I warned them. A forensic analyst later confirmed the metadata. Dates, recipients, internal comments, marked reviewed, no action required, reclassify as documentation variants, avoid discoverable phrasing. One internal message from Elaine Mercer became the center of a new warrant request. Do not create preventable death language unless legally unavoidable. Agent Monroe read it once, then again. The words were clean. That made them worse. At Blackstone, the staff began to split. Some defended the hospital because they needed it to be good. They had given years to those halls. They had missed birthdays, holidays, school plays, and last calls from aging parents because the ER was short-staffed and patients kept coming. To admit the institution was rotten felt like admitting their sacrifices had fed something cruel. Others began whispering names. A woman in room 11. The veteran with abdominal pain. The child with the delayed antibiotic. The man discharged with dizziness who came back unable to speak. Carla Ruiz called Maggie from her car after shift engine running doors locked. I have 3 incident numbers, Carla said. Maggie closed her eyes. Do not tell me details on an unsecured line. I know, I just needed to say it to someone. Say it to Agent Monroe. Carla was silent. I have kids. I know. My husband's hours got cut. If they fire me, we lose the house. Maggie gripped the phone tighter. I know. That is all you're going to say. No, Maggie said. I'm going to say the truth should not require you to risk your children's roof. But they built it that way. Carla started crying without sound. Maggie waited. Finally, Carla whispered, "Give me the number." Threats arrived after the witnesses did. At first, they were digital. Anonymous messages. Traitor, liar, attention seeker, hospital killer. One said Maggie should have stayed in the desert. Another included her home address. Then, 2 nights later, she walked out before dawn and found all 4 tires on her truck slashed. A note was tucked beneath the windshield wiper. Traitors do not get to play hero. Maggie stood in the cold driveway with the note in one gloved hand. Her breath fogged the air. The neighborhood was still. Somewhere a dog barked twice and stopped. She did not touch anything else. She called local police. Then Agent Monroe, then Caleb, because if he found out from someone else, he would never forgive her. He answered on the first ring. Are you hurt? Number. Do you have protection? The police are coming. That is not what I asked. Maggie looked at the mountains black against the early light. I am not leaving my house because cowards own knives. Caleb's voice broke through the official restraint. Damn it, Mom. She let that land. Let him be angry. Let him love her badly for a second. I am safe, she said. No, you are controlled. Those are different. Agent Monroe arrived before the tow truck. She wore a dark coat and carried herself like someone who had learned not to waste movement. She photographed the note, the tires, the street, the porch, the security camera angles. You need to stay somewhere else for a few days, Rachel said. Maggie looked at her truck. I have been threatened before. Rachel lowered the camera. By people trained to miss. Maggie turned. Rachel held her gaze. This is not a bravery test. Maggie almost argued. Then she saw Sophie's car slow at the corner. Sophie had heard and come over face pale behind the windshield. She parked badly and ran up the driveway. "Oh my God." Maggie folded the note and placed it into an evidence bag Rachel held open. Sophie stared at the tires. "They did this because of us." "No," Maggie said. "They did this because of themselves." Sophie wrapped both arms around her body. "I am scared." Maggie looked at the young nurse at the way fear made her seem even younger. "So am I." Sophie looked up. Maggie had not meant to say it, but once the words were out, she did not take them back. "I thought you did not get scared." "I get scared every time something matters." Sophie wiped her face with her sleeve. "What do you do with it?" Maggie looked toward the road where the police lights were beginning to flash blue and red. "I make it wait its turn." 3 days later, federal agents executed search warrants at Blackstone Regional. The hospital did not look like a fortress then. It looked like a place surprised by daylight. Agents entered through administration medical records, risk management, and pharmacy. Staff watched from hallways as boxes were sealed and hard drives removed. Dr. Pierce walked beside legal counsel with his face drained of color. Elaine Mercer stood in her office doorway, posture-perfect lips pressed together. Vance arrived late, still wearing surgical scrubs under his coat. He saw Agent Monroe near the nurse's station. "Where's your warrant for my operating room?" he asked. Rachel turned. "If we need it, doctor, you will know. You people are turning clinical judgment into a crime." "No," Rachel said. "We are examining whether crimes were hidden behind clinical judgment." He stepped closer. "I saved lives in this hospital. I believe that is true." The answer seemed to wrong-foot him. Rachel continued. "The question is whether you believed that gave you permission to endanger others." Vance said nothing. Across the lobby, reporters gathered behind security barriers. Outside, 2 groups shouted over each other. One carried signs that read, "Save Blackstone." Another carried photographs of patients who had died. Heather Mallory stood with a photo of Eric in both hands. Lena Keene stood beside her. Tom was not strong enough to be there, but his army cap was. Maggie wore it tucked under one arm as she walked toward the courthouse annex for her formal statement. A reporter called her name. "Miss Walker, are you trying to shut down the hospital?" Maggie stopped. The microphones surged forward. She looked at the glass entrance, at the bronze plaques, at the slogan still shining behind the reception desk. Precision, compassion, excellence. Then she looked back at the reporter. "I'm trying to make sure people who walk in alive are not sent home to die." She did not say more. By the end of the week, the first indictments were filed. Dr. Preston Vance, Dr. Nolan Pierce, Elaine Mercer, 2 risk management officers, 1 records administrator. Charges included obstruction of justice retaliation against protected witnesses, conspiracy to falsify medical records, healthcare fraud, and criminal negligence connected to selected patient harm cases. Not every death became a charge. Not every mistake became a crime. Prosecutors chose the cases where the evidence showed warning, disregard, and concealment. Blackstone's emergency department was placed under emergency operational review. Ambulance diversion protocols began. Patients were rerouted across the city. Community anger deepened because danger and dependence had lived in the same building. On the courthouse steps, Vance walked past cameras in a dark suit. No white coat, no scrubs, nothing to signal healing. A reporter shouted, "Dr. Vance, do you have anything to say to the families?" Vance stopped. For a moment, Maggie thought his lawyers would pull him away. They did not move fast enough. He turned toward the cameras. "I saved more lives than any of them will ever understand." The crowd quieted. Heather Mallory's face crumpled. Lena Keene stared at him like she was seeing the man from that night for the first time without hospital lights around him. Maggie stood across the steps, Tom's cap under her arm, and felt the final piece settle into place. Preston Vance did not think he was guilty. He thought he was owed forgiveness. Preston Vance stood on the courthouse steps and said he had saved more lives than any of them would ever understand. The sentence traveled through the crowd like a cold wind. No apology, no hesitation, no grief for the names written on poster boards, no recognition of the women standing 10 feet away holding photographs of husbands who had entered Blackstone alive and left beneath white sheets. Just the same hard certainty Maggie had seen under hospital lights, the certainty of a man who believed skill could wash blood from every other part of him. Maggie watched him disappear through the courthouse doors. Tom Keene's cap rested under her arm. The fabric had softened from being handled so often, but the brim still held its shape. She ran her thumb once along the faded army patch, then stepped toward the entrance. Inside, the courthouse did not sound like a hospital. There were no monitors, no alarms, no wheels rattling over tile. Just shoes against marble doors opening and closing, low voices, paper shuffling, the restrained breathing of people trying not to fall apart before strangers. Agent Rachel Monroe met Maggie near the security checkpoint. "You ready?" Maggie looked past her at the courtroom doors. "Number." Rachel gave a small nod. "Good. Ready people worry me." Maggie almost smiled. They walked together down the hallway. Reporters leaned over the barriers calling her name, but the words blurred together. Combat nurse, whistleblower, Attorney General's mother, former employee, accused, hero, traitor. The world kept trying to choose a label because labels were easier than the truth. The courtroom was already packed. On one side sat families. Heather Mallory was in the second row holding Eric's wrestling whistle in her fist. Lena Keene sat beside Tom, who wore a dark suit too large for his thinner frame. He had insisted on coming. His cardiologist had objected. Lena had objected louder. Tom had listened, nodded, and come anyway. Sophie Grant sat near the aisle, hands folded so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Carla Ruiz sat behind her. Daniel Brooks sat alone in the row across, jaw-set eyes fixed on the prosecution table. On the other side sat Blackstone's old world in expensive fabric. Board members, consultants, lawyers. A few physicians who still looked angry that anyone had questioned the hospital publicly. Elaine Mercer sat with her back straight and her hands folded in her lap. Dr. Nolan Pierce looked pale, but controlled his silver glasses, catching the overhead light. Preston Vance sat at the defense table without looking at the families. When Maggie passed behind him, he turned his head slightly. For 1 second, their eyes met. There was no hallway now, no supply room door, no hand on her arm, no monitor screaming from room 9. Only a courtroom and everything he had not been able to bury. All rise. The judge entered. Everyone stood. The trial began without music, without thunder, without the clean drama people expected from stories told afterward. It began with procedure, motions, names, instructions to the jury, the careful machinery of law moving one piece at a time. Then the prosecutor stood. Her name was Evelyn Shaw, and she had the calm voice of someone who did not need to perform outrage because the facts were already heavy enough. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she said, "this case is not about punishing doctors for being human. Medicine is difficult. Emergency rooms are imperfect. Good clinicians sometimes make decisions that end in tragedy. That is not why we are here." She walked slowly toward the jury box. "We are here because the evidence will show that leaders at Blackstone Regional Medical Center recognized dangerous patterns, concealed those patterns, punished the people who reported them, and protected themselves while patients paid the price." Vance stared at the table. Evelyn continued. "You will hear about Thomas Keene, a retired Army officer who entered Blackstone with signs of a cardiac emergency. You will hear how those signs were dismissed. You will hear how a nurse escalated concerns, how she was threatened, and how that patient survived only because his family left the hospital in time." Lena reached for Tom's hand. "You will also hear from families whose loved ones did not get that chance." The courtroom seemed to tighten around those words. The defense rose after her. Vance's lead attorney, Martin Kell, was polished and silver-haired, with a voice built for reasonable doubt. He buttoned his jacket slowly before approaching the jury. "The prosecution wants to turn tragedy into crime," he said. "They want you to judge medicine from the comfort of hindsight. They want you to believe that every imperfect outcome is evidence of corruption, and every disagreement in a hospital is proof of conspiracy. He gestured toward Maggie without looking at her. At the center of their story is one former nurse. A nurse with a distinguished military background, yes, but also a nurse with a long record of conflict with physician authority. A nurse who acted outside the chain of command. A nurse whose son holds one of the most powerful legal offices in the United States. Caleb was not in the courtroom. He had stayed away exactly as he said he would. His absence felt louder than his presence might have. Martin Kell softened his voice. This case is not about silence. It is about control. Who had it, who wanted it, and who broke rules to seize it. Maggie listened without moving. She had been shot at by men who were less deliberate. The first days belonged to documents. The prosecution showed emails, internal reports, adverse event reviews, meeting notes, and audit trails. They built the hospital piece by piece, not as a building of glass and stone, but as a machine that redirected blame downward and profit upward. A records analyst explained altered timestamps in patient files. An IT specialist described deleted draft reports later recovered from backups. A former risk management assistant testified that certain complaints were moved into a category labeled non-discoverable review after Dr. Pierce or Elaine Mercer requested edits. Martin Kell objected often. Sometimes the judge sustained him, sometimes not. The jury took notes. Maggie watched their faces more than the lawyers. One juror, a middle-aged man with reading glasses, frowned every time a document used soft language around serious harm. Another, a young woman with braided hair, wrote quickly whenever a family member's name appeared. Daniel Brooks testified on the fourth day. He walked to the stand in a plain gray suit that did not fit him well. He looked nervous until the oath was finished. Then he seemed relieved, as if telling the truth had been waiting inside him so long that fear had become the smaller burden. Evelyn Shaw approached. "Mr. Brooks, what was your role at Blackstone Regional?" "I was the night shift pharmacist." "How long did you work there?" 6 years. "Why did you leave?" Daniel looked toward the defense table. "I was given the option to resign or be terminated after reporting safety concerns." "What kind of concerns?" "Medication overrides, dose discrepancies, delayed reconciliation, reports being downgraded before review." He spoke carefully, not like a man trying to sound dramatic. That made him stronger. He described a patient given the wrong concentration of medication because an override was approved without proper verification. He described a blood thinner error nearly missed because a nurse caught it at bedside. He described filing reports that later returned with language changed from serious medication variants to documentation inconsistency. Evelyn placed an email on the screen. "Did you write this?" "Yes." "Who received it?" "Dr. Pierce, Elaine Mercer's office, Risk Management and Pharmacy Leadership." "Was there a response?" "Yes." The response appeared. "Thank you for your attention to safety culture. Please avoid speculative language regarding patient risk until formal administrative review." Evelyn let the jury read it. "What happened after this email?" "My access to reporting systems changed. My schedule was moved. Then a controlled substance discrepancy appeared under my login." "Did you create that discrepancy?" "Number." Martin Kell stood for cross-examination with a sympathetic expression. "Mr. Brooks, you were under stress at the time, correct?" "Yes." "You had conflicts with supervisors." "I reported concerns to them." "That was not my question." Daniel looked at him. "Yes, there were conflicts after I reported concerns." Martin smiled faintly. "And you are angry?" Daniel paused. "Yes, angry people sometimes interpret ordinary workplace actions as retaliation, do they not?" Daniel looked toward the jury. "Ordinary workplace actions do not usually begin after you warn that patients could be harmed." The courtroom went quiet. Evelyn did not smile, but Maggie saw her pen stop moving for a moment. Heather Mallory testified the next day. She wore a navy dress and carried no papers. Before she walked to the stand, she touched the wrestling whistle in her hand, then gave it to Lena to hold. Evelyn's voice softened when she began. "Mrs. Mallory, tell the jury about your husband." Heather inhaled. "Eric was a coach. He taught history and wrestling. He believed teenagers could become decent adults if someone made them run laps and tell the truth. A few people in the gallery laughed gently through tears. Heather continued. He made pancakes every Saturday. Burned the first batch every time. He said the first batch was for the pan. Her voice wavered, but she held it. On the screen, a photo appeared. Eric Mallory, smiling beside two daughters in school uniforms, both girls leaning into him. Heather looked at the photo only once. The night we went to Blackstone, his speech was strange. His right hand was weak. He said the room tilted. I told the nurse, I told the doctor, I told anyone who came in. Who was the attending physician? Dr. Vance. Vance looked down. What were you told? That he was dehydrated, stressed, maybe having a migraine. They said he was too young for what I was afraid of. What happened? He got worse. Heather's mouth tightened. They waited. Then they transferred him. By then, they said there was swelling. Damage. Words started changing. First, it was stroke. Then, it was unfortunate progression. Then, it was not preventable. Evelyn walked to the evidence table. Did Blackstone contact you after his death? Yes. In what way? They sent a grief counselor first. Then someone from administration. Then a lawyer. The settlement agreement appeared on the courtroom screen. Certain private amounts were sealed, but the language remained visible. Confidentiality. No admission of liability. No disparagement. Release of claims. Heather stared at it. They told me answers would not bring him back. Her voice broke then, and they were right. But the lie kept him gone in a different way. Martin Kell was careful on cross. Too careful. The jury watched him walk around her grief like a man avoiding broken glass. Mrs. Mallory, you understand that not every stroke can be prevented. Yes, and you are not a doctor. Number. Your belief that care was delayed is based on your experience as a wife, not medical training. Heather looked at him. My experience as a wife is why I knew something was wrong before your experts did. Martin paused. That does not answer the medical question. No, Heather said. But it answers why I kept asking for help. Lena Keene squeezed the whistle in her hand until her fingers hurt. When Tom testified, he moved slowly to the stand. Maggie watched him rise, and every nurse instinct she had wanted to tell him to sit down, conserve strength, breathe. But Tom had not come to be protected. He had come to be heard. Evelyn asked him to describe the night at Blackstone. Tom adjusted the microphone. I remember rain. I remember my wife being mad at me because I kept saying I was fine. A soft ripple moved through the courtroom. I remember Nurse Walker telling me to stop being brave for 10 minutes. That made me listen because it sounded like something my best sergeant would have said. He glanced at Maggie, then back to the jury. I was scared. I did not say so because men my age are stupid about that. I thought if I called it heartburn, it might become heartburn. What do you remember about Dr. Vance? Tom's jaw tightened. He looked at me and saw inconvenience. The defense objected. Sustained, the judge said. The jury will disregard characterization. Tom nodded. Then I will say this. He did not make me feel examined. Nurse Walker did. Evelyn asked, did you request transfer? Yes. Were you forced? Number. Were you confused? Number. Why did you agree to leave? Tom looked at Lena. Because my wife was afraid, and Nurse Walker was the only person in the room treating her fear like information. Lena put a hand over her mouth. On cross, Martin Kell tried to separate gratitude from fact. Major Keene, you are grateful to Ms. Walker. Yes, you believe she saved your life. I know she did. You know that because another doctor told you so. Partly. Tom leaned toward the microphone. I also know because I was inside the body that was dying. Martin let a moment pass. Did Ms. Walker tell you Dr. Vance was wrong? Number. Did she tell you the hospital was dangerous? Number. Did she tell you to transfer? She told my wife we had the right to request transfer. And you do not see that as influence. Tom looked at him with the tired patience of an old officer listening to a bad briefing. Counselor. When a building is on fire and someone points to the exit, I do not accuse them of influencing me against the flames. The juror with reading glasses stopped writing and looked up. Lena testified after him. She was not calm at first. Her voice shook when she described the car ride, Tom insisting he was fine, his face turning gray. Under passing streetlights, the rain so heavy she almost missed the hospital entrance. But when she reached the moment in room 9, her voice steadied. I asked if he was having a heart attack. Dr. Vance made me feel foolish for asking. Nurse Walker made me feel responsible for listening to what I already knew. Martin Kell asked if fear affected her memory. Lena answered, fear sharpened it. He asked if Maggie had emotionally pressured her. Lena looked at the jury. My husband was on a bed sweating through his shirt. His blood pressure was falling. A doctor wanted to wait. A nurse wanted him evaluated. If that is pressure, it came from reality. Sophie Grant was called on the 8th day. She looked younger on the stand than she had in the hospital. Her hair was pulled back and her hands trembled until the judge asked her to speak up. Maggie wanted to look away to spare her, but Sophie needed to see at least one steady face in the room. Evelyn began gently. Ms. Grant, were you working the night Thomas Keene came to Blackstone? Yes. What was your role? ER nurse. I was assisting Nurse Walker. Did you observe Dr. Vance interacting with her after the transfer? Yes. Did you record part of that interaction? Yes. Why? Sophie swallowed. Because things at Blackstone had a way of changing after they happened. The video was admitted. The courtroom lights dimmed slightly. The screen showed the hallway outside room 9 angled from Sophie's scrub pocket. The image shook at first. A slice of floor, a wheel of the medication cart. Then Vance's voice. You just signed the death certificate on your career. No one moved. On the screen, Maggie stood with her back against the supply room door. Vance's hand was on her arm. His face was close to hers. You think because you patched up soldiers in tents you can overrule me in my emergency room. The video played through the threat to shove Mercer's arrival, Maggie's controlled voice asking to discuss why a cardiac patient had almost been discharged. When the screen went dark, the silence felt physical. Evelyn asked, was that video altered? Number. Did anyone at Blackstone know you had recorded it? Not that night. What happened after you came forward? My manager warned me to think about my future. Hospital counsel said I may have violated policy. Some coworkers stopped speaking to me. Why testify? Sophie looked down at her hands, then at Maggie, then at the jury. Because I used to think courage meant not being scared. That night I learned sometimes it means shaking and still pressing record. Martin Kell rose for cross. He had to be careful with Sophie. The video had done damage that aggression could deepen. Ms. Grant, you recorded inside a hospital without authorization. Yes. You understood that patients have privacy rights. Yes. Yet you chose to record. There were no patients visible. I recorded a physician threatening a nurse. You made that judgment yourself. Yes. You were influenced by Ms. Walker, were you not? Sophie looked confused. Number. She was your mentor. Yes. You admired her. Yes. You wanted to protect her. Sophie paused. I wanted to protect the truth. Martin studied her. That sounds like something Ms. Walker would say. Sophie's voice steadied. No. It sounds like something Blackstone made necessary. Maggie lowered her eyes for a moment. Agent Monroe testified last among the investigators. She did not tell the story emotionally. She did not need to. She built it with records. A table of complaints, a timeline of edits, an audit trail showing that after the preservation notice, a records administrator accessed archived mortality reviews tied to 3 named patients. An email from Pierce advising department heads to avoid language that implied preventability. Mercer's message about not creating preventable death language unless legally unavoidable. The jury saw a hospital not making one mistake but rehearsing the art of making mistakes disappear. During cross-examination, Martin Kell tried to paint the investigation as biased because of Caleb Walker. Agent Monroe. You were aware Ms. Walker's son is the Attorney General? Yes. And you understood the sensitivity. Yes. Is it not true that his position gave this case unusual attention? Rachel did not blink. This case was open before Ms. Walker reported retaliation, but her report accelerated it. Her report added a living patient, a witness video, and immediate records preservation concerns. Evidence accelerated it. Martin paced. You expect the jury to believe the Attorney General's mother received no special treatment. Rachel looked at the jury, then back at him. I expect the jury to look at the documents, the timestamps, the video, the patient outcomes, and the testimony. None of those things share her last name. Maggie saw Vance shift in his chair. Then came her turn. The bailiff called her name. Megan Walker. The courtroom seemed to narrow as she walked to the stand. She placed her hand on the Bible, swore the oath, and sat. The microphone smelled faintly of metal and dust. Evelyn Shaw approached with no papers in her hand. Ms. Walker, what is your profession? Registered nurse. How long have you worked in nursing? 27 years. Where did you begin? United States Army. What kind of work did you do there? Trauma care. Field stabilization. Combat support, hospital operations. Later training and coordination. Did that experience affect the way you practiced nursing at Blackstone? Yes. How? Maggie looked at the jury. It taught me that delay can look calm from the outside. It taught me that patients do not always deteriorate loudly. It taught me that rank matters, but the patient matters more. Evelyn let that sit. Tell us about Thomas Keene. Maggie described his arrival without decoration. Pale skin, diaphoresis, chest pressure, jaw discomfort, left arm symptoms, unstable blood pressure, abnormal rhythm. She described notifying Vance, requesting escalation, documenting his refusal, and providing transfer information to Lena and Tom. Did you diagnose him with a heart attack? Number. Did you tell his wife he was having one? Number. What did you tell her? That I was concerned his symptoms may be cardiac, and that he needed further evaluation. Why? Because that was true. Evelyn walked to the screen and displayed the first EKG strip. Was this enough by itself to confirm the diagnosis? Number. What was it enough to do? Continue evaluation. Repeat testing. Escalate care, not discharge. Vance stared at her with an expression Maggie could feel more than see. Evelyn asked. When Dr. Vance threatened you after the transfer, how did you feel? Martin objected. Relevance. Evelyn replied, goes to retaliation and witness intimidation. The judge allowed it. Maggie looked at her hands. Angry, afraid, not surprised. Why not surprised? Because at Blackstone the punishment often came after the evidence. Martin Kell stood for cross-examination with a folder in one hand. Major Walker, he said. Maggie is fine. I prefer Major. You have used your military background throughout this case. I answered questions about my work history. He smiled. You are comfortable giving orders. I am comfortable giving clear instructions in emergencies. You believe civilian hospital hierarchy is flawed. I believe any hierarchy becomes dangerous when it cannot be questioned. Answer yes or no. Did you believe Dr. Vance was wrong? Yes. And you believed you were right? Yes. You believed your judgment was superior to his. Number. Martin turned slightly toward the jury. You just said you believed he was wrong and you were right. In that moment, about that risk, yes. So superior. Number. Responsible. He paused. Responsible for a patient whose attending physician had given orders. Responsible for a patient in front of me whose condition was worsening. Martin opened the folder. Let us discuss your record. Blackstone noted concerns about your aggressive documentation style. They noted my documentation after I filed safety reports. You were described as rigid. Yes? Difficult with physician authority. With unsafe physician authority. Martin's eyebrows lifted. You added unsafe. I clarified the missing word. A few people in the gallery shifted. The judge looked over his glasses. Ms. Walker, answer only the question asked. Yes, Your Honor. Martin moved closer. You sent a message to your son after termination. Yes. Your son is the Attorney General of the United States. Yes, you understood that contacting him could create pressure on Blackstone. I contacted my son to tell him I was safe and that retaliation had occurred. He instructed me to use the proper hotline. How convenient. Evelyn objected. Sustained, the judge said. Martin rephrased. You expect this jury to believe you did not use your son's position. Maggie looked at him. I spent my adult life in uniform. I understand chain of command better than anyone in this room. My son's position made the line more important, not less. Yet you texted him first. No, I documented first. Martin stopped. Maggie continued before he could interrupt. I wrote down the timeline while memory was fresh. Then I told my son I was safe. Then I called the hotline. That is the order. He looked irritated for the first time. You transferred a patient without authorization from the attending physician. The patient requested transfer. A receiving physician accepted. I documented the attending's refusal and the patient's condition. You are not a physician. Number. You cannot practice medicine. I did not. You made a judgment that saved him. Maggie held his gaze. Yes, that sounds like practicing medicine to me. No, she said, that sounds like nursing. The room stayed still. Martin closed the folder. You are proud of what you did. Maggie looked toward Tom and Lena, then back to the attorney. I am relieved he lived. That is not what I asked. No, Maggie said. It is the only answer that matters. The defense called its own experts. One emergency physician said Tom Keene's early presentation could have overlapped with non-cardiac causes. A hospital administrator described the complexity of managing risk in high-volume medical centers. A former military psychiatrist spoke broadly about hypervigilance in combat veterans until Evelyn forced him to admit he had never examined Maggie, never reviewed her full military record, and could not diagnose her from personnel notes written by hospital administrators under federal scrutiny. Then Preston Vance insisted on testifying. His attorneys tried to soften him before he took the stand. Everyone could see it. Martin Kell leaned close, whispering. Vance nodded, expression flat, as if accepting advice from men he believed were useful but inferior. He walked to the stand with the same posture he used in the ER. Controlled, commanding, certain that if he spoke clearly enough, the room would remember who he was. Martin began gently. Dr. Vance, how long have you practiced medicine? 23 years. How many patients have you treated? Tens of thousands. How many lives have you saved? Vance looked toward the jury. I could not count. He described trauma calls, emergency surgeries, impossible nights, blood loss, crushed vehicles, gunshot wounds, ruptured organs. He reminded the jury that medicine was not clean, that decisions happened fast, that not every symptom meant catastrophe, that nurses did not carry the burden physicians carried. For a while he was effective. Maggie saw it. So did Evelyn. The jury needed to understand that Vance was not incompetent. That was what made him dangerous. He knew enough to know better. On direct examination, he said Tom's presentation was nonspecific. He said Maggie escalated improperly. He said he was angry because unauthorized transfers could harm patients and expose hospitals to risk. He denied assaulting her, calling it an attempt to stop a chaotic situation. Then Evelyn stood for cross. She carried one folder and nothing else. Dr. Vance, you have saved lives. Yes. You are skilled. Yes. You expect obedience in an emergency. I expect professional discipline. You expect nurses not to question you in front of patients. I expect concerns to be raised appropriately. Evelyn walked toward the screen. Let us define appropriately. She displayed Tom's vitals. At 12:19, Mr. Keene's blood pressure dropped. Were you informed? Yes. At 12:21, Nurse Walker requested you return to the room. Yes. You declined. I gave orders. You did not return. I had other patients. Were any of those patients more unstable than Mr. Keene? Vance paused. I would need to review. Evelyn displayed the board from that hour. You reviewed it yesterday. His jaw tightened. Number. No, they were not more unstable. Number. Evelyn nodded. At 12:25, Nurse Walker requested cardiac escalation. You threatened consequences if she went around you. I warned her not to violate protocol. Those were not your words. The video transcript appeared. If you go around me, Walker, you will regret it. Evelyn turned back. That is what you said. Yes. Was that a clinical instruction? It was a warning about professional consequences. For escalating a deteriorating patient. For bypassing physician authority. There it was again. The word that always came before the patient disappeared. Authority. Evelyn let the jury hear it. Then she asked, would you make the same decision again? Martin stood. Objection. Hypothetical. Overruled, the judge said. Vance looked at Maggie. He could not help himself. Yes, he said. I will not apologize for refusing to let nurses run my ER. The sentence seemed to leave him before strategy could catch it. Martin Kell closed his eyes for 1 second. Evelyn stepped closer. No further questions. Closing arguments came 2 days later. The defense argued that the government had criminalized medical disagreement, that grief had shaped memory, that Maggie had violated chain of command and then benefited from political proximity, that Blackstone had administrative flaws, but flaws were not felonies. That Vance was arrogant, perhaps, but arrogance was not a crime. Evelyn Shaw stood last. She did not shout. Arrogance is not a crime, she said. A mistake is not a crime. A bad outcome is not automatically a crime. But when people see danger and hide it, when they punish the people who report it, when they rewrite records, when they tell grieving families that questions are merely grief, when they allow the same failures to repeat, because the truth is too expensive, then we are no longer talking about imperfection. She faced the jury. Thomas Keene lived because someone refused to confuse authority with care. Eric Mallory died in a system where too many people had already learned to keep quiet. This case asks one question. Not whether medicine is hard. It is. Not whether doctors deserve respect. They do. The question is whether power inside a hospital can become so protected that patients lose the right to be believed. She returned to the prosecution table. The jury left. The waiting began. It lasted 3 days. Maggie spent most of that time outside the courthouse walking the same block until her body understood the pattern. Rachel told her to go home. Lena told her to eat. Sophie brought coffee she forgot to drink. Tom sat on a bench with his cane between his knees and said nothing for long stretches. On the second evening, Heather Mallory sat beside Maggie on the courthouse steps. I keep thinking if the verdict is guilty, I will feel better. Maggie looked at the traffic moving through the dusk. You might. Heather nodded. And if I do not? Maggie searched for an answer and found only the honest one. Then you wake up the next day and keep breathing anyway. Heather held Eric's whistle in both hands. He would have liked you. Maggie looked down. I'm sorry I never met him. He would have made a joke about you being terrifying. Smart man. Heather laughed once, and the sound broke into tears. Maggie stayed beside her until the shaking passed. On the third afternoon, the bailiff opened the courtroom doors. The jury had reached a verdict. Everyone stood when the judge entered. Maggie felt the air change, felt the old battlefield stillness when everyone knew something irreversible was about to happen. The foreperson stood with the verdict forms. On obstruction of justice, guilty. Elaine Mercer closed her eyes. On conspiracy to falsify medical records, guilty. Dr. Pierce swallowed hard and looked at the table. On retaliation against protected witnesses, guilty. Sophie let out a sound she tried to bury in both hands. On healthcare fraud connected to selected billing and documentation practices, guilty. On criminal negligence connected to the death of Eric Mallory, guilty as to Vance and Pierce. Heather made no sound. Her body folded forward like someone had cut the strings holding her upright. Lena wrapped both arms around her. Not every count returned guilty. Some were not proven beyond a reasonable doubt. One patient harm count failed. A conspiracy charge against a lower-level administrator returned not guilty. The judge read each result evenly and the unevenness made the moment real. The verdict was not vengeance. It was law doing what law could do and no more. When it ended, Vance sat motionless. For the first time since Maggie had known him, he looked smaller than the room. He turned once toward the gallery, not toward Heather, not toward Lena, not toward the families, toward Maggie. His face held anger still, but something else had entered it. Not remorse. Recognition, maybe. The recognition that the room had stopped obeying him. Maggie did not look away. The sentencing would come later. Appeals would come later. Civil suits, licensing hearings, restructuring orders, federal oversight, congressional questions, and years of paperwork would come later. In that moment, the only sound Maggie heard was Tom Keene breathing steadily in the row behind her. Outside the courthouse, reporters surged again. Maggie did not speak at first. Heather spoke. Lena stood beside her. Daniel Brooks answered questions. Sophie said only one sentence. I recorded what everyone was supposed to pretend did not happen. When microphones turned toward Maggie, she looked out over the crowd. Some faces were hungry for triumph, others for anger, others for tears. She gave them none of that. Today belongs to the patients and families, she said. Ask them what they need. Then she stepped back. Weeks passed before the hospital changed in ways people could see. Blackstone's emergency department closed under federal order for restructuring. Ambulances were diverted to Memorial Heights and St. Agnes. The city argued. Some residents were furious because Blackstone had been the closest ER. Others said distance was better than danger. Nurses who had done nothing wrong were suddenly job hunting. Patients with no part in the scandal sat longer in other waiting rooms. Maggie hated that part. She attended a community meeting in a high school gym where people shouted until their throats went raw. A man stood and said his wife might die because the nearest emergency room was now farther away. A Blackstone nurse cried while explaining she had worked double shifts for years and still believed most staff had tried to do good. Maggie sat in the back and listened. When someone recognized her and asked if she was proud, she stood slowly. No, she said. I am not proud that a community lost access. I am not proud that good staff were hurt by leaders who failed them. I am not proud that families had to fight for the truth. I am grateful a dangerous system was forced open. Those are different things. No one clapped. That was fine. The work after the verdict was quieter, less cinematic, more important in ways cameras rarely loved. Federal monitors entered Blackstone. External reviewers examined mortality cases. Settlement practices changed. Staff reporting channels moved outside hospital leadership. Whistleblower protections were rewritten into contracts. Serious safety complaints could no longer be routed only through internal risk management. Families received clearer disclosure rights. NDAs could no longer be used to hide preventable patient harm connected to public safety investigations. Maggie was asked to return. Elaine Mercer was gone. Pierce was gone. Vance was gone. A temporary administrator called personally and said Blackstone wanted to restore trust. They offered title, salary, public apology, anything that sounded like repair. Maggie listened from her kitchen table. Tom's cap sat beside the old trauma shears. When the administrator finished, Maggie said no. He seemed surprised. May I ask why? Maggie looked at the mountains beyond the window. Because the next nurse who speaks up should not have to stand behind my shadow. She ended the call gently. She did not retire. That was never going to happen. 3 months after the verdict, Maggie walked into a training auditorium at a military medical education center outside San Antonio. The room smelled of coffee floor wax and new uniforms. Young medics, nurses, residents, and physician assistants filled the seats. Some wore civilian clothes. Some wore camouflage. Some looked eager. Some looked terrified. The best ones often did. Sophie sat in the front row, no longer hiding her nerves, only carrying them differently. She had taken a job at Memorial Heights. Carla was there too, having joined a patient safety review team. Daniel Brooks had been invited to speak later that afternoon about medication reporting systems. Tom and Lena stood near the back wall. Tom leaned on a cane but looked stronger, his army cap back where it belonged. Maggie placed her old trauma shears on the table at the front. The room quieted. She looked at the faces before her and did not see an audience. She saw future rooms, future alarms, future patients insisting they were fine while their bodies told the truth, future doctors too tired or too proud to listen, future nurses deciding whether to swallow a concern because rent was due and supervisors were watching. She touched the shears lightly. "These are old," she said. "The tape is bad, the hinge sticks sometimes, I keep them anyway." No one moved. "They remind me that tools do not make decisions. People do." She walked to the edge of the stage. "You are going to work in rooms where everyone speaks at once. Families will be afraid. Patients will minimize pain. Monitors will lie by omission. Charts will lag behind bodies. Some people above you will be brilliant. Some will be kind. Some will be wrong. A few will be dangerous because they have mistaken being obeyed for being right." Sophie's eyes stayed fixed on her. Maggie continued, "When that happens, your job is not to win an argument. Your job is to protect the patient in a way that can stand in daylight. Assess, escalate, document. Use the chain of command. And when the chain becomes a wall, find the lawful door through it." A young medic raised his hand. "What if speaking up ends your career?" The room went still. Maggie looked at him for a long moment. Then the career was already standing in the wrong place. She let the answer settle not as a slogan, but as a cost. After the session, people lined up to speak with her. Some thanked her. Some told stories. Some asked what to do about supervisors' reports' fear. Maggie answered each one carefully, never making courage sound easy. When the room finally emptied, Tom approached with Lena beside him. He removed his cap and held it out. "I believe this has been on loan long enough." Maggie took it, then placed it back in his hands. "It belongs to the man who wore it into the storm." Tom's eyes shone. "You gave me years I was not supposed to have." Maggie shook her head. "No, your wife got you through the door. Sophie preserved the truth. Dr. Bell opened the artery. I was one part of the line." Tom smiled. "Spoken like someone allergic to gratitude." Lena laughed softly. Maggie allowed herself to smile. Sophie came up beside them. "I start charge training next month," she said. Maggie looked at her. "Good. I am terrified." "Better." Sophie groaned. "You could say something comforting." "I just did." They stood there together as the afternoon light stretched across the empty auditorium floor. Outside, a helicopter passed overhead, its rotors beating through the air. Maggie looked up automatically, the old reflex still alive in her bones. For once, the sound did not pull her backward. It moved on. Later that evening, Maggie walked alone across the training center parking lot. The Texas sky was wide and burning gold at the edges. Her phone buzzed. "Caleb." She answered. "You done scaring young medical professionals?" he asked. "For today." "How did it go?" They asked hard questions. Then they had the right teacher. Maggie stopped beside her rental car. For a while, she listened to the distant helicopter fade. "Your father would have liked today," she said. Caleb was quiet. "Yeah," he replied. He would have pretended not to cry. He was terrible at pretending. "So are you." Maggie looked down at the old trauma shears in her bag, their taped handles visible beneath the open zipper. "No," she said, "I am excellent at it." Caleb laughed softly. The sound warmed something in her chest that had been cold for a long time. After the call, Maggie did not get into the car right away. She stood beneath the open sky and let the evening air move over her face. Blackstone had been built like a fortress. Glass, money, titles, policy, silence. It had taken one patient who lived, one wife who refused to doubt herself, one young nurse with a shaking hand, one pharmacist with records, one widow with grief sharpened into testimony, and one combat nurse who had learned long ago that fear could not be allowed to command the room. The fortress had not fallen all at once. It had cracked where the truth kept pressing. Maggie closed her bag, opened the car door, and looked once more toward the sound of the helicopter disappearing into the darkening sky. Then she drove home.